name is Samara Chadwick. I'm programming, curating the VRRV initiative, which is a really wonderful exchange program between Canadian and German creators in virtual reality, organized by the Goethe Institute, the Auswärtiges Amt, and a series of festivals, including Republica. We've been having a series of conversations and labs in Montreal 2 weeks ago, and now 25 creators from all over Germany and Canada are here at Republica to continue the conversations about VR and also develop prototypes of projects that are also trying to challenge our understanding of what VR can be and also who VR creators are. So we've got two members of the VRRV crew here on this panel. This is a panel that's a continuation of a discussion that we had in Montreal 2 weeks ago, Visualizing the Invisible. It's really very much about the intersection of virtual with reality in the sense of journalism specifically. This panel's going to bring together various creators who are discussing VR as it intersects with trauma and war and conflict and all these difficult situations in which virtual reality has this kind of instinctive urge to be embedded, but then there's the problematics of that embedding. So I'd like to introduce Annina Zwettler, who will be moderating. She's from Arte, Germany. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Samara. I won't talk a lot. I just start with a little screening session. It will be about 10 minutes, but it's better to start now with the images and the films and then talk about it.
There are police herring off to the east of the city to Porte de Vincennes. In the last hour, we've heard that there's been an attack on a Jewish supermarket. There are 5 hostages, we understand, inside.
Someone came down to the basement. The hostage came and told us, go back up, otherwise he'll come down and kill everyone. I didn't want to die in a basement. If this had to be my end, then I'd prefer it happens up in the light. So I told myself, well then, I'll go upstairs then.
Suddenly, this lorry was speeding through the market. I could see how people that were just standing a bit further ahead of me, they had no time to get out of the way.
Dann habe ich eben diese Frau gesehen, die...
Then I just saw this woman lying on her side in a big pool of blood. And I said something like, do not move, I'm with you. I often said, I'm with you, do not worry. I remember holding her hand, stroking her face, so she just knows someone is there.
There were a lot of situations in this time of starvation, but I don't want to talk about everything. Once, a woman was torn to pieces before my eyes. All this happened in broad daylight, in the middle of a beautiful landscape. It was unbelievably beautiful that winter. Bright sunlight, everything covered with snow.
It's all burned onto my memory. Everyone ran for their lives, every man for himself. I had my little brother in my arms. And then, thank God, we got into the bunker. And the bunker was shaking, and stones were falling onto us. And we sat down there, and we thought, this is the end.
It's like my grandma telling me what she experienced during the war. It's deeply touching, much more than film.
One after the other, and not just one. You know, there was one and then one. They were in the series, a very frightening thing. And it's the sound, I think, that I shall never forget. That terrible low sound.
So, the whole project you can see, especially the ones from WDR, you can see here at Republica as well. They're exhibited in actually 2 venues here. So if you're interested, please approach. Oh, I'm a bit stuck with this. Sorry. Cable cows. Yeah. So, welcome. And I would like to introduce you to this panel. Liam Maloney, he's based in Toronto. He's a visual journalist, coming actually from photography, documenting not only the brutality of our life and of wars, but that was one of the things you did. And your images were published in numerous journals like The Time, Le Monde, and so on. And since some years you're looking for new forms in telling and talking about those situations, those cruel situations, and you have also lived in Syria for quite a while in a refugee camp. So this is Liam Maloney, and then there's Sophie Schulenburg. She's a journalist and editor at WDR, Westdeutscher Rundfunk. You're working for the Hier und Heute Redaktion. So you're doing classical TV broadcast reportage, but on the other hand, you got involved into telling stories such as the Paris story and Berlin story in virtual reality. And Carolin Wiedemann, she is a editor for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Quarterly, and she's a writer and researcher, and she's actually investigating in topics of new forms of racism, sexism, new forms of war, and she's also interested in topics how, for instance, what Facebook means, the self-representation of Facebook means. So you are also publishing books in this field, together with, I think Sönke Zähle was involved in another project with you. And you're looking very much also to the meta level of what's going on in our digital society, what it means to us. So we've seen those examples now, and it's definitely one of the harder topics you could touch with virtual reality. And then we saw also the example of augmented reality that WDR is actually working on. So actually I want to ask the three of you, why choose VR as a medium for such difficult stories? Does it make sense? So who wants to start?
Yeah, maybe I can start. Well, the answer to that would probably be we use VR because it's there. It's a new medium we're experiencing, we're seeing it develop, and we're seeing content being developed for virtual reality. And as journalists, we've asked ourselves, what is our job? Our job will probably be to develop some significant storytelling in journalistic context and see how we get a good story for VR, how to tell a good story for VR, what are the stories we can tell with VR that have the impact that we would like the stories to have. So we do it because it's there.
Okay.
I think that it's very difficult to sustain an audience's interest in something that is particularly a long-term conflict like the war in Syria or political developments in the Middle East. It's very hard to sustain interest over a period of time. We're used to the 24-hour news cycle, and we're used to the sort of flashbang event happening, and then we move on to something else. I think if you're talking about placing the events of a conflict in some sort of historical context, then it makes sense to use a medium like VR. Because first of all, it's innovative and people are drawn to innovative technologies. It's unexpected. You give them something that they haven't tried before, and so they're a bit more open. They're a bit more willing to explore some of the issues that we are trying to bring to the public on a daily basis.
So you're using actually the attraction of having a new medium, so a gadget, and then you draw them into a difficult story.
Well,
so it's like the bee and the honey.
I don't think that VR is. I think VR maybe was, a gimmick, or it was treated as a gimmick, and it was used in a gimmicky way. But I think there are lots of different ways to explore these kinds of stories, as we've seen with your work, in ways that are respectful, that provide information and tell a story that engages viewers.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think for us sometimes the technology is more an obstacle than something that draws people into the story, because we actually, the BBC has once published a slide saying there's 20 obstacles until a viewer can actually view a story told in VR. So it's not for the technology that we do it, but we see the technology, we see what it offers, we see the way it works, and the way you can create maybe a deeper understanding of reality when you tell a story for VR, and that's what we're interested in, because we see we have to look for ways to tell relevant stories for this medium.
Carolin, what do you see?
Yeah, sorry, there was just some very strange noise in my earphones. Like your last point, I think that's very important. What is the main task of journalism? It's to make, it's one of the main tasks is to make people understand the world a little better, in order also to be able to change something and then to make the world better, perhaps. And what you just said is to use VR in a way that makes people understand better how everything is connected, how it works, and so on. And that's one argument that is somehow quite different from, I think, the main argument that is made all the time by people that are the main actors in developing the technology, and that is, their argument is it's an empathy machine. And I think that is also, it might be a huge part, but there are perhaps two problems, especially when somebody like Mark Zuckerberg is so much strengthening this argument. It got very obvious how ironic somehow it is when he was on stage and so happy about this cool technology that makes him somehow experience an environment like Puerto Rico, and he got a shitstorm afterwards because he was so happy about the technology, and it showed how much this empathy discourse is also a selling argument for people who create the technology and are just interested in the profit with the technology. And then on the second level, and that's reconnecting to your arguments, it's we have to add something. It can't be like reduced to having an experience of immersing into a different environment. We have to add a level of analysis and information in order to make it able to understand something better.
That's a very good applause. Thank you, Christiane.
We know the people who applause.
Yeah, but it's completely right. And have a look to this list. We were having a very nice discussion amongst you in the sun outside before this panel, and actually with the empathy thing, I think we're not really sure what to do with it. But we all agreed VR is not representing reality, and also VR journalism is not representing reality, even if Mr. Zuckerberg thinks we can represent reality 100%. And what do you think? What's this reality thing that we want to copy reality in virtual reality? And what would we actually do more? For what is virtual reality extremely useful?
Well, I think it's a misrepresentation of what VR can do to assume that you can throw somebody into another place, a hostile environment, a difficult situation for 5 minutes, and then suggest that they actually have any kind of understanding of what people are actually going through in that place. I think that's really wrong-headed and not at all the right way to approach journalistic approaches to VR. I mean, the title of this talk is Visualizing the Invisible, and I think VR gives you an opportunity to approach news stories in a more conceptual manner, and maybe you don't need to show people everything. Maybe you don't need to be in a 360 environment all the time. Maybe there's value in stripping things down to the essentials, the story. I mean, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, maybe if you've seen the two examples in the Berlin-Paris Terror VR, you saw that we have worked a lot with the invisible in not showing things. I mean, we've actually reduced the world that you go into by using animations, and in the one context in Paris, we've even used very minimalistic animations, and for a reason, because obviously we're trying to tell a story in a difficult environment, and it's not us telling the story, but it's actually witnesses of the events who tell the story. So that's the first thing. It's not us, the storyteller, but it's authentic people telling the story. But of course, it's not for sensational reasons or for voyeuristic reasons. So we're not using like the very well broadly seen media pictures that everybody's seen, but we've looked for a different way of presenting these worlds, and that's very important. We don't need to show everything to leave an impact. Sometimes it's just how you tell the story, why you tell the story, and what story are you really telling, which is the point. And that, I think, in VR is a very... You have to look into the story in the same way as in every other medium as well.
I just want to recall in your mind, we saw the images from the war. We had blurry images from people lying dead on the street. You provided those pictures. Yeah. They were taken by civilians, I think you got sent them. And then on the other hand, we had this abstraction in VR of also a terror attack. There were also people included dying, but they're not represented. And even the situation, how they were taken as hostages, is very abstract. So maybe, Liam, you could also talk a bit, because you're struggling with these images of cruelty, because you're dealing a lot with those pictures, and what do you think about those images?
Well,
war?
I don't think that it's my duty necessarily as a journalist to bludgeon people with horrific imagery all the time. I don't think that's really helpful. I don't think it does anything other than shock people and repel them. And so, in a world where almost every news event or historical event is already documented by citizen journalists or people who just happen to be there with their mobile phones, and everyone has a camera in their pocket, maybe there's a way to kind of get under the skin of that material. We know what that looks like. It's on the front pages of our newspapers every day. But there is value in that material. There's information there. But what's the story? Like, how can we get into the story? How can we make people who are consuming our content comfortable enough to enter into that story and open themselves up to what's happening around them?
Yeah, just it's connected to what you said, and coming back to the question of like the task of representing reality. Regarding the current political developments, it's often like the right-wing parties rising and racist attacks. It's often said that media also has like a responsibility in this whole movement right now, and because there's no alternative scenarios to what then conspiracists and right-wing parties call our future, and which is quite horrible and dark and dangerous. And I think one task for journalists would also be to create scenarios of what the future could look like and how we could get there, which different kinds of future scenarios we could imagine. And VR, I mean, you could say, you could also create it, you could also just write a text about different kinds of visions of society and how we could get there. But I think there VR is, has quite a plus, which is the individual role that everybody has in the responsibility of getting there and experiencing of what it would really feel like, and how your own behavior affects this environment.
So you're actually also talking that, well, VR journalism, it can be journalism about tourism, it can be journalism about the future, about technology. We all know the newspapers having the section talking about technical gadgets, but rarely they talk about the consequences of those digital gadgets. And actually we're now talking specifically now about the conflict zones in journalism and how to talk about the cool side of our life and of humanity. So I think, what do you think? Is there genres where you would just say leave it out, or VR is not the right medium, or is this too generalistic? So do you think in every genre there is the possibility to do something, or in VR or AR?
Well, I think that there are two schools of thought with VR. You can use VR for everything, tell every story in VR, or be, and some people really believe that VR, done well, can be applied to any kind of story, and I think that's probably true. But do you really want to push all your resources in that direction? Probably not. I mean, I read a print story yesterday afternoon. That was a very simple story, beautifully told. It was a love story about a couple who were torn apart by the conflict in Syria. And it was by a colleague of mine, and I got to the end of the story and I wept. It was that good. And this is a very simple print story with a couple of illustrations, pen and ink illustrations. So you don't always need to throw every piece of technology at a story to get somebody to feel something. I think VR has all kinds of baggage and problems from an ethical standpoint when you're operating as a journalist. I mean, you're working in a medium that requires a pretty significant amount of technology and writing, and the story can change in ways that you can't predict. People can accuse you of playing fast and loose with the truth. Truth is obscured by the technology. So you have to keep this in mind, and I think maybe one way around that, or one way to address that, is to be perfectly transparent about your process, how you get from a story to a scene in a headset.
Yeah, I think especially when you, like what I just suggested, especially when you mix documentation and then also the creation of possible scenarios. So then you have to be especially clear on what is what is facts or what has happened, and like where did you get the material from, and then what are and on what do you base this rather potential future scenarios, which research is it based on, and I think, yeah, as you just said, it's so important to make this transparent, and also when you integrate the person that somehow experiences it, it's what you both were telling us in our earlier discussions. You were asking what can we show or what is accessible. You really have to be careful in not re-traumatizing people. Yeah, I think you have to say more about it.
That's a good question, actually, and I would like to ask you, Sophie, when you did this Berlin-Paris project, how did you really get into the story, and how did you do the setup, and how did you got those stories and those people talking in VR?
It's a good question. As I said before, we were working with eyewitnesses, so it's not us retelling the terror attacks, but it's rather in Berlin there were first responders, the people who were actually accidentally drawn into this situation and decided immediately to help. In Paris, we were actually speaking to 3 hostages, two of which hadn't spoken, well, had one rarely, one not at all spoken to the media before. And of course, it's a very difficult discussion. It was within our team as well. Can we do that? If we do it, how do we do it? And we decided to be very straight about it. We in Berlin, we were working very closely with a trauma expert. Like from the question on, can we already contact people? Is it early enough, half a year after their attack? Can we already address them? And is it okay, or what will it do to them? And in Paris, we actually worked together with the Victim Association of Terrorist Attacks in France, and through them, because they actually liked the idea of what we're doing, they were addressing the victims and saying, look, maybe you should talk to the WDR, it will be good for you to tell your story, and this is a good surrounding. So our experience was a very big responsibility towards the stories and towards the people involved. I mean, it's their story, we're actually have to live up to.
Do you know any reactions? Did they see the VR piece?
Yeah, we know some reaction. I mean, for Paris, I can say 2 of them saw it and they were okay with it. They liked it's difficult for them, but they liked the work we did. And the older man who we saw in the video as well, he got a linear version of it because he couldn't cope with the technique as well. But yeah,
I think it's actually an interesting thing that the Victim Association had the idea in mind that it could help actually a victim to be involved in this project to get over his trauma. But do you think there is also potential to re-traumatize people in VR with such stories, or if it's not done with journalistic accuracy?
You can probably traumatize people a lot with VR, depending on what you do with content. I mean, it's whatever. What is always the question? What is the story you tell? How do you do it? Where are your limits? What do you show? What do you not show? What experience? I mean, you're throwing someone in a situation, so you have to be very clear about what is For example, in Paris, if you go with us into this documentary, you find yourself being in the cellar with the people. You kind of questioning yourself: am I one of the hostages? Some people feel they are, some people feel they're not. But and then you hear these sounds coming from above. You hear someone is there. You know, it's a threatening situation, and you have to be aware that what you're actually asking people to live through. And then you have to see how much sound do we want to implore, and do you want to scare people, or do you just want to make them give an idea of what it could have been like? So I think you have to be very careful not to traumatize people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, your mind knows that what you're seeing is a recreation of an event, but your body doesn't necessarily respond in the same way. You have this sort of separation of your head and your body, actually, that I like to call VR this sort of like digital guillotine that, you know.
It's interesting that the consciousness knows it's not reality, but your body reacts as if it were reality. Did any one of you talk to psychologists so far, or in the project? You talked to the trauma expert, but it's also a story. But did you ever approach psychologists? Would you integrate them in a process?
I don't think that would be a bad idea. I know that VR is actually also used to treat people who who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So there is you can flip it around. I think.
Yeah. No, I also read some studies of how it affects your neural networks, and also has a long-term effects and impact, and which can be used in good ways to overcome fears also. And for example, like people who are afraid to fly, they can also exercise and practice with VR technology. But at the same time, it could be dangerous if there's no expert like helping people to go through it, or somehow observing or the process of how it then affects people.
So actually, do you think I think that's one of my opinions, actually, it's good that the technology is a bit itchy so far, because most of the time we consume this technology and someone else is around because you need some help. I think it's also maybe a good thing that at the moment you always have someone to talk to afterwards. You take off the goggles.
Actually, I quite like the idea of the VR cinemas. You know, like we have it here. Like you are in one room with many people, and either you watch or watch the same movie, which is very good because afterwards you can actually talk about your experience, or you just feel a lot of people doing the same, and you can actually exchange afterwards. I think that's a very good move.
I mean, one very important thing, I think, is we are talking about journalism, and at the same time, the most progressive hardware is right now developed by a company owned by Facebook, and there again we have the problem, as already with so many developments connected to the IT world, that actually like editorial teams, journalists should rather be part of these developing teams instead of people who are just interested in selling the stuff, of getting more money by developing it. And it's also a criticism, like I'm working for FAZ, and they just like found out that internet is perhaps important for journalism. So
you're very critical. I hope no one is around from your bosses. So actually you were referring to that VR as a medium as such, without the content, has a message. And this message, because we could refer to McLuhan and say VR is the message, okay, then we can discuss this. But I think your point you're making is how we perceive the medium VR as such is driven by companies, by industries that they have their mindset what VR should be. Is that right? Do you want to? So that would actually mean that we need to have another way of. So that's why it's so important to have real stories in the medium, and telling it in a different way than the big companies would imagine, right? Do you think they like the stories we're telling in the moment, what you are doing?
I haven't really thought about that, because the way we look at it, we've seen what we do. We do VR stories, and at the same time we see, there's augmented reality. Let's try that, and let's see. It has advantages and it has disadvantages compared to virtual reality stories. Let's see how we can use that technology and see how we can use how we can tell our stories there. So it's a lot more accessible. It's a lot less difficult to watch. You're not as immersed maybe as in VR. So our view to the things is rather to look how can we tell our stories, not does Facebook like them? I don't know.
I want to come back to Liam. Actually, what's the motivation now? You're going into a complete different direction, not taking images anymore as a photographer, but searching for new ways. We saw this one project we saw with the text. It was only a short part of it. It's much longer. I just cut it off. So what you're replacing the image by something else.
Well, I think we've seen quite enough photography of possibly enough for my lifetime, anyways. The photojournalism, the field that I have come out of, is very good at replicating itself. There are certain tropes of representation that you see over and over and over again, and part of that is because history does resemble itself, at least in the short term. But there is also this kind of instinct to recreate pictures that you've seen before in some way. You recognize a photograph and then you make that same picture, and this is why a photograph taken yesterday of refugees crossing the Syrian border looks a lot like a photograph taken in Albania in 1999, and that photo probably resembles the images that we saw coming out of Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. The pictures all look the same, and after a while it's really hard to get people to give a shit about these stories and about the people behind the images. So VR offers an opportunity, as I said before, to kind of sidestep those tropes and maybe explore a new way of telling stories.
I think one thing, knowing a bit what you're working on, is you don't want to use VR especially as a visual medium, but also a medium where the sound and the abstract data is there, but not actually the images of the cruel situation. Is that right?
Well, have you ever been inside of a one of these isolation salt bath spaces? It's a weird experience. But there is something to be said for removing components and allowing people to immerse themselves in a more pure understanding of the story, either through just audio or fragments of audio, or finding ways to interpret data in a visual way that you wouldn't expect. There are no limits in VR, and I think as journalists we should stop thinking that okay, we're journalists, so we have to take photos or record audio or conduct interviews or take detailed notes and then reconstruct a scene. I mean, this is how we work as journalists, but I think there are other ways to take all that information and create something compelling that people will remember, that will stick with them for a long time. And it doesn't always have to be so visual and so
cool.
It doesn't have to look like TV,
Okay. And it doesn't have to be like linear as a story. It can rather also different to reading a story or to a video or to an audio. If you combine all these formats, and also it's the first time that you create a space that is somehow accessible, and in a space you don't have to have the linear narrative, but you can create more complexity and somehow show which rather than represents the world also in a more accurate way, if you can realize how it's connected and the causalities and correlations, and I would imagine if you really enter an VR scenario and have a technology that perceives your whole movement and you're part of the scenario, then you can, I don't know, you can somehow click on anything or open anything and get some information of how this thing there came into being and got there and so on. And I mean, that's very simple what I just say, but you can like create it in a very complex way, I think.
Yeah, I think if you talk like that, how can we use VR for journalism? Journalism is very broad, you know. If you would ask me, I would always say you look for the good story, because that is what keeps people in your narrative, really, and like what keeps Liam reading the print story until the end and weeping, you know. But of course, there's different ways to journalistic approaches, and probably a lot you can do. Yeah.
So you see future for VR and AR, definitely, I guess, right? So because we're doing this now for some years, I had this feeling this year, at the beginning of the year, well, maybe also we at Outreach should maybe stop doing now and then wait a bit and then come back. But actually, should we carry on?
It's a good question, because what we experience is, we came here last year and we come here this year and we're like, nothing has changed. There's still people coming like, wow, yeah, the same people come, look at the stories, the same questions, the same, how does this work? Can you help me? You know, so, and still among my friends, no one who owns a headset, you know, so I'm still waiting for some distribution of these things. So yeah, we have to see. At the moment, what I see is a progression on the expert level. So we're like talking on conferences and we're talking about the techniques, and the storytelling is getting better and better. But not the broad public is still not taking care, still not noticing what we're doing, really. So let's just wait.
It's not accessible for the broad public, the hardware that you need for at least this like scenarios that I was talking about, but yeah, or for really virtual reality scenarios. Yeah, the HTC Vive or something is not accessible maybe, but of course you can go get cardboard boxes, and our things are published on YouTube and Facebook, so obviously you could watch them. There's just not much use.
I mean, the New York Times distributed cardboards when they launched their VR production, and that was kind of a bold move. But I don't know how many people still pick up those cardboards and watch new content all the time. I think it's still a fairly limited audience. I don't have access to those numbers, but
Graham Roberts, I talked to him when he's responsible for this part of New York Times at the beginning of the year, and the numbers are still quite good, because the people once downloaded the app, they still have the app on their iPhone, and New York Times actually did publish very regularly news stories. So they really trained a lot of journalists doing 360 videos all over the world. So but actually they're also now in a moment in being more selective and not just making a mass production of 360. That's what I learned at the beginning of the year, but that might change very quickly. Talking about not being accessible in the broader public, is there something else missing actually in the whole picture? Because you're working for WDR, you're working for FAZ, you're writing. Where is the criticism about VR programs?
I give that question to you.
Okay, but I'm not. No, I'm not speaking from the FAZ perspective now. But again, perhaps rather a criticism directed to these huge companies. When Facebook bought Oculus Rift and Mark Zuckerberg had his first talk about it, he described his vision of creating VR as creating social encounters or making social encounters possible. For instance, that he, based in San Francisco, or I don't know, but can directly be part of his friend's birthday in Paris just by putting on his Oculus Rift thing, and then the others at the party in Paris, they would also have Oculus Rift and would see him as if he was there, and so it sounds very exciting, and not only at the party but also walking on the streets in Paris, and the conditions of this very exciting scenario, which is rather like an utopia about beaming somebody somewhere, but the preconditions are that you grasp everything, that he announced also back then a collaboration with Google Street View, and then you, for like this scenario to really happen, you would have to record everything what is going on in the world all the time, at any place, and then you could allow real-time beaming to other real-time immersion to any place, and there are, I mean, it brings big problems of who owns all this data which is recorded all the time, and also the next question, is it possible to really record everything and to grasp anything that happens? Is it possible to replicate the world on another level? What is it's questions about also about natural and artificial experiences, and yeah, also very philosophical.
So we have now two topics we need to go on discussing. The one is about the data harvesting of VR, consuming VR. And then there's this other topic about criticism, about programs. Actually, did you have reviews about your programs?
Internal reviews, and then on conferences, and when we show the experience, we speak to people, but there was no like feuilleton critique or media page in newspapers or something. No, not that we've seen.
There is no press coverage, right?
No. No.
If there's any journalists, please write reviews.
Yeah, we'd be so happy.
Because my observation is that there is a lot metadata discussion. You have a lot of coverage about what is VR and the newest gadgets and what's developing, but not about single programs, single projects. So I think that it's very necessary that it's established, that we also get a cultural praxis about what's good in VR and what is not good in VR, what stories can be told, which stories do not work, what about sound, what about the image, all the criteria coming in a VR experience. So if you're here and is there any journalist, please start writing about VR and VR programs. We are missing that.
Yes.
So then there is this other aspect, data. What do you think? Is it scary, that the data thing?
I think it's troubling that this technology is sort of now effectively owned by the biggest social media network in the world, and so the pace of progress of developing that technology is going to be designed to match their needs as they expand their platform and continue collecting people's data. As opposed to meeting the needs of people like us who would like to inform and possibly entertain people. So, yeah, I mean, there's now an expectation that as soon as a social media company gets involved in something, that they are going to find a way to mine data from that. We know this. It's in the agreement. And I have no idea what kind of data they're going to get out of a headset, but I mean, it could get kind of spooky.
Would you?
Yeah, no, I'll go with him.
So just imagine that. I think that's something important, that we should not just look at one VR program, but if we talk about especially social VR, where we meet in VR in real time with streaming, all the data are collected. But also if you watch WDR experiences or Arte 360 experience, we also collect data. But are we doing something with it? I don't even know what my colleague being in charge and hosting the app is doing with the data.
But I've seen the WDR asks you if you actually want to send your data.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So, is there any questions in the audience for the three of them? Yeah, there's one hand. Shall I run or no?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Magita. My question is about the WDR, so terrorist VR experience. I was wondering why you chose that, that storytelling, why you chose to show people in a virtual reality how a terror attack feels like, how the victims felt, and how oneself might feel. Because I think terrorists want us to talk about them a lot and to have this sensation of that it could happen to any one of us. They want that in the society. They want everyone to be scared of it and feel those feelings, and so the free society is disrupted and we all are scared of those things. So I was wondering, why did you choose exactly, to show that reality to people?
First, may I ask you, have you seen the two documentaries, or have you just, are you asking me this because you've seen the film now?
No, to be honest, I actively chose not to watch them because I don't want to know how I would feel in a terror attack. It's more likely that something will happen to me in a car accident, so why would I want to explore how I feel in a terrorist attack?
I can understand. I feel a vague memory. We had hard discussions on these questions in our team. Actually, the stories we're telling are stories about empathy in times of terror, really, of compassion. We're definitely not telling you how you feel if you're like a victim of a terrorist attack, but we're telling a story in Berlin of empathy and compassion, really. It's the focus of the storytelling is what is my reaction, what is my first reaction if I see someone needing something. There is a context of a terror attack, but what we found important is to tell the stories that nobody told. In the time, in the news coverage, in the media, everything was about the victims and about the terrorist and about the attack. But about all the people who were actually spontaneously willing to stay, to help, and to live with this afterwards and to live with their memories. Nobody told that story, and that's the one story we're telling. And in Paris, actually, the supermarket attack on this Jewish supermarket was 2 days after Charlie Hebdo, which was terrible. And you will all remember the media coverage of Charlie Hebdo. It was not everybody was Je suis Charlie. 2 days later, there were these hostages in the Jewish supermarket. It was a direct connection to the Charlie Hebdo Kouachi brothers. But nobody remembers this attack. So what we were saying is what we're trying to do with the storytelling is telling a story that some remember, most didn't, and all forget. And that's why we decided to tell these stories and not the terror. But, for example, in Paris, the hostages, they were very quickly understanding that they were being attacked because they were Jewish. And they didn't know if they would make it. And they were helping each other in this situation. And that's the story we were telling. So I would like to encourage you to come and, and maybe try one of the two stories and see what it makes with you.
Hi, I'm Martin, and I just have one question. The name of this panel is, or the title of this panel is, Making the Invisible Visible. I didn't get it until now. What is the invisible that you can make visible only with virtual reality, that you can't make visible with videos, photos, text?
I think there are a lot of hidden narratives that journalists have had difficulty exploring with traditional media. That VR gives you some options to explore. For example, right now I'm looking at citizen journalism that's coming out of the war in Syria, and most of this material is extremely difficult to watch. You can maybe get through 12 minutes before you have to take a break. You have to watch it without sound. You have to watch it small on your screen because otherwise it will have an impact on your psychological state. But this content is incredibly important. It offers evidence of human rights violations, and it tells a story of a conflict, the first conflict to be mediated entirely by smartphones, and with content uploaded on a daily basis, something like 200 or 300 videos per day, more than that maybe. So how do you, this is very important information, I think, as a journalist, and I think that my readers or my viewers should have a way into that story. They should be able to develop a deeper understanding of the conflict through this media. But if you can't show them the media because it's too traumatizing, you need to find other ways to display it or to immerse people in it. And I think that VR gives us that opportunity. But maybe I'm not answering your question.
Perhaps I could add something, because I could also, I mean, I think it was an answer to the question, but there's also, I think, something else or another, not another answer, but another invisible that can become visible or accessible by VR. And I think we were a little bit talking about it. For example, that's the scenario creation that I wanted to point to. It's for me, if I try to imagine what it feels like, what it could look like to live in a completely controlled smart city, for example, like it already exists in very few places in the world, for example in Songdo in South Korea, and in a story or in a documentary or in all the traditional media formats, you could not make visible how really daily life would feel like, how your own actions, this interactive level makes something more visible. That's what your own behavior, which impact it has. And then I could create a VR project where I just wake up in the morning in Songdo and realize that all my movements are already somehow recorded and making the environment react. And yeah, I think that's also one aspect that is important in this invisible thing. Yeah.
I don't have a microphone. I have to grab your microphone. Does it help? It's good that you pointed out again to the title, because there's so many aspects we have to look at when we talk about journalism and VR, and I think it's about perspectives. In the end, it's about perspectives and different ways of looking at something, and may it be text, may it be an image, may it be someone just telling you the story. May it be a YouTube video, may it be a broadcast documentary. All mediums can be used to tell the story in a different way and giving different angles and perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think the time is up. 1 minute. So I would like to thank you and encourage every one of you to really have a close look to those programs being produced, because they are there, they are in the world, and it's quite a lot of productions that have been produced so far, and we need to talk about them, and you can only talk about them if you really look at them. Does it make sense? So thank you for coming, and have still good days at Republica.
Yeah, thank you, Annina.
Thank you for the three of you.